are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and I'm here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time to talk about military history, doctrine, and leadership practices from which I distill lessons that we can apply to our businesses and professional practices. So kicking off the new year, 2026, season 4 of Business Lessons from the Military. So it's kind of wild. I've been doing this for 4 years. But the first year of the show, the first season, I did a series on Marine Corps warfighting doctrine and translated that into business principles. So I'm going to start out this year giving not exactly equal time to naval doctrine, one of the other sea services, but I'm going to be talking about a man by the name of Alfred Thayer Mahan. His name is not particularly easy to pronounce, and back in 1890, he wrote a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, from 1660 to 1783. This was one of the most influential books, military-oriented books, literally of all time. It did not just have a powerful impact on American naval doctrine, but indeed virtually across the world, Japan, Europe, even China to, I think, a certain extent, was influenced by Mahan's view of how sea power worked and how it was part of an integrated system. And so I'm going to give you just a brief biography of Alfred Thayer Mahan so you can understand a little bit about him as a person. And then over the next 4 episodes, I'm going to talk about the doctrine that he developed and translate that into business principles that we can then use to hopefully have a prosperous and fantastic 2026. So without further ado, Alfred Thayer Mahan was born in 1840 in West Point, New York. Now, that alone should clue you in, because West Point, as it's more commonly known, is the location of the United States Military Academy, where Army officers are trained. He was born into a deeply military and academic family, and his father, Dennis Hart Mahan, was a renowned military theorist and professor at the military academy at West Point. And so Mahan's perspective and strategic mindset was developed from a very early age. He graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1859. This was just before the American Civil War started in 1860-61. And he did serve during the American Civil War, gaining firsthand experience with naval operations, blockades, logistics, combat, etc. He was a competent, sea-based commander, but he was not by any means a standout leader in the actual, I'm trying to think of the word, the actual application of naval power. And this kind of pushed him in the direction toward intellectual leadership, as opposed to being, a great naval commander like a David Farragut or a John Paul Jones, someone like that. So he became an instructor and later president of the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. And excuse me, he refined and during his time at the Naval War College, he really defined his ideas on strategy. And then, as I mentioned a couple of moments ago, he published The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 through 1783, in 1890. Notice that there was a 100-year gap between when his history ended and when he wrote the book. I think he recognized that one needs to have a fairly lengthy perspective to really understand the sweep of history. So this work really synthesized centuries of naval warfare. Although he states 1660 to 1783, it's really reflective of the larger sweep of naval history. So he synthesized the sort of centuries of naval warfare and commerce. And his basic argument was that naval strength, commerce, and national policy are inseparable, right? And if one looks at, for example, Great Britain, which at the time that Alfred Thayer Mahan wrote his book, was still the greatest naval power in the world, and indeed maintained an empire essentially solely through the Royal Navy. An empire, by the way, the saying was, the sun never sets on the British Empire. That's how extensive it was worldwide. So Great Britain was an example of this merging of naval strength, commerce, and national policy. So his ideas directly influenced U.S. naval expansion, including the Great White Fleet under President Theodore Roosevelt, and the creation of overseas bases, coaling stations, for example, because the Navy was transitioning from sail to steam. And it was not just the United States, indeed, that was influenced, as I mentioned before. Germany embarked on a naval expansion. In fact, all the major powers of Europe embarked on naval expansions. That was part of the lead up into World War I, which in Europe started in 1914. So it was read globally by political and military leaders, shaping arms races, imperial strategy on into the 20th century, as I just mentioned. So it's hard to understate the impact that Mahan and especially his book had on, indeed, world history, not just military history or the fates of particular nations. And indeed, World War I, as I mentioned just a moment ago, was kind of a demonstration of the kind of, or a kind of an outgrowth, partly, not totally, but partly an outgrowth of the expansion of navies among the European powers. And indeed, in that way alone, Mahan had a tremendous impact on the world. The first, world war could be, I don't want to say traced to him, that would not be accurate, but his theories and such definitely impacted what the kinds of issues that coalesced and created the atmosphere that led to World War I. So starting today and over the succeeding 3 weeks, I'm going to be looking at different aspects of Mayer's thesis, kind of his worldview on sea power, on governing, and like I said, developing some lessons that we can use in the business world, in our professional practices. If like me, you have a professional practice. Okay, so the first concept I want to talk about is that Mayer felt that sea power was a system, not a fleet. Okay, so if we think about how, for example, Great Britain or Spain looked at sea power going back to, say, the Spanish Armada. So, how could this, what at the time was a scrappy nation of Great Britain, defeat what was at the time the greatest sea power of its day, Spain, right? And it wasn't just due to the audacity of the English leaders, of the English naval officers, and the stoutness of the English sailors. It had to do with something more than that. And although it probably wasn't recognized by Queen Elizabeth, or for that matter, the admirals at the Admiralty, England had already started to develop this sort of concept of sea power as a system, not just a fleet. And so, setting aside there was some luck and such in the British victory, Britain recognized that the ability to sustain its fleet was as crucial as the fleet itself. So one needed to have ports, one needed to have logistical support to be able to build ships, repair ships, supply ships, and one needed to have a system for recruiting. I'm using that word with air quotes because the impressment system was essentially how England manned its ships. But you need to have a system for getting enough sailors to man its ships. It needed to have a process for developing naval leadership, hence the system whereby young men, when I say young, they sometimes as young as 11 or 12 years old, could be midshipmen on a ship, actually going to sea, where they learned to be naval officers, right? And boys even younger could sometimes be cabin boys. So again, this was part of the system of developing the manpower that was necessary in order to make a fleet powerful, along with the political support that was necessary, not just to have a navy. Lots of people would presumably be in favor of a powerful navy, but it's the cost of maintaining that navy, right, which requires taxing the populace. And so there has to be political support for that, not just among, in the case of England, the ministers of parliament, but among sort of, the middle and upper class, who were the segments of the population that could afford to pay taxes. Okay, so all of this was part of the system that England developed that made it the predominant sea power, roughly up until World War I. The United States, pardon me, in the interwar years, as it developed the aircraft carrier and other facets, the United States was poised to become the dominant sea power. I don't want to say it was necessarily in the interwar years, but certainly as a result of World War II, the United States became and has remained the dominant sea power in the world. So, in Meyer's view, a fleet without infrastructure is essentially strategically hollow, because if you cannot maintain the fleet, then you're not going to, it serves no value. It's not able to project power or be meaningful in the execution of the policy of a nation. Okay, let's take a quick break, and I'll be back. I'll come back and talk some more about Mayer Thayer. America is a maritime nation Our freedom and security depend on strong sea services. The Beverly Hills Council of the Navy League stands with our Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and Merchant Marine through community support, education, and advocacy. For over 120 years, Americans of all walks of life have heeded our call. No prior military service is required to join our mission. The Beverly Hills Council of the Navy League of the United States. Help us support those who serve at sea. Visit NavyLeague.org. So this is Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel. I'm talking about Alfred Thayer Mahan's book, The Influence of Sea Power on History. And I'm starting what is going to be a 4 episode series looking at his ideas, his thesis, and applying it to the business world. So the first one I talked about was that sea power is a system, not a fleet. And so the same thing can be said about our businesses. We can't run our businesses as siloed entities, okay? Everything has to be integrated. And the more effectively we can merge the parts and get them working in concert so that they're gears that are operating together, okay? The better we can do that, the more effectively our businesses will run, both from the standpoint of serving our clients and customers, and in terms of meeting whatever objectives we have. And so, as we develop our plans, I think we need to be conscious of, if I'm going to create an initiative, how does this fit into the overall scheme of my business? Okay, so I'll use my own company as an example. And most of you know my primary business is acting as a professional fiduciary, or what's also known as an independent trustee and probate administrator. Okay, so much of my focus is creating strategic relationships with other companies so that I can form teams with the people necessary to be effective for administrating a particular trust or estate. But then as I look at my own business, so included in my own business is a small media company. You see its name down there, Snappy Patter Media, right? That produces the shows that I do, right? So I do a show called Trust and Estates Weekly. I do that show for a couple of reasons. One is to offer an opportunity to the people with whom I work to come on the show as guests and talk about their expertise and share it with other people, right? So it's a platform for the people with whom I work to help them, showcase themselves and build their businesses. That's number one. Number two, it's an opportunity for me to show my knowledge and expertise, right? So people who watch the show, they can say, oh, Kevin knows about X, Y, or Z. Kevin has connections with these other people. Okay, great, right? So in each of the other shows, well, with the exception of Jiggers' Place, which I do pretty much purely for fun, but the other shows all are they're all geared to support other parts of my business. So I have a consultancy called Hebrew Advisors. And this show and People Making Money are designed to support that aspect of my business as well, right? So I look to be very integrated in how I handle my business and make sure that if I'm going to take time to do something, how does it support the overall effort? Okay, so we don't want to develop sort of isolated products, isolated services. Those really, they take a lot of resources, and they divert us from our primary focus, which I realize is somewhat redundant, right? So we want to be, integration is really the key word. So, and if we have weak support functions, okay, so that's going to undermine all the other parts of the business. Okay? That's why, rather than developing a vertically integrated trust administration organization like you might find in a trust company, for example, okay, I've chosen to build an integrated trust administration practice by teaming with other top professionals. And that way I can bring in just the people who are necessary for that particular trust or estate. And the administration of that trust and estate is not burdened by the fact that I've got a huge overhead that I need to feed, part of which is not applicable to this particular matter. Okay. So I look at my business as a system, not as the individual parts. Okay. That's number one. Number two, trade follows security. So this was this is the next of Mahan's principles. So when we're talking about trade, we're talking about global trade. In Mahan's day, it was primarily the exchange of goods, whether it was raw material like metals or agricultural goods, cotton, flax, those kind of things, or whether it was finished goods, machinery, consumer goods, which was starting to get traction at the time he wrote this book. Okay, so in concept, nations that protected trade routes accumulated wealth and influence. And going back to the example of Great Britain, that is why Great Britain was able to become the greatest empire of its time, because it protected trade routes. Okay. It also had a very robust commercial fleet that was privately owned. Okay. But that commercial fleet wouldn't be nearly as effective if it hadn't been wouldn't have been nearly as protected, I should say. It wouldn't have been nearly as effective without the protection of the Royal Navy. So that's another aspect of integration of sea power, kind of going back to the first one, right? Okay, so commerce declined quickly when security failed. So if we go back to the early days of the American Republic, when we were trying to develop trade with other countries, one of the problems we had was being preyed upon by the Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean Sea. So until America was able to effectively deal with those pirates, her ability to expand commerce was attenuated. Okay. And that's why, in the end, Thomas Jefferson, who was not a particularly bellicose president, when he had to decide whether to pay tribute to essentially the leaders of the pirates, the Bay of I'm going up on the name of the country, but anyway, rather than or essentially go to war, he essentially said the great quote, millions for war, not a penny for tribute, right? So he recognized that once he went down the road of paying, essentially buying off the pirates, he was to a certain extent at their mercy. Okay, so he needed to establish the security of the American merchant fleet, and the way to do that was to build a strong US Navy, right? So the same thing is true in the business world, whether we're talking about literally being engaged in trade, where our business is selling products, or we're selling services. Okay, we need to erect a strong security apparatus that supports those functions that are the actual revenue producing functions. Okay. If we shortchange the security functions, what we're actually doing is putting our revenue at risk. So, what does it mean to implement the security necessary in order to support the revenue um, generating functions? So it may mean, for example, robust cybersecurity. So if a lot of what we do is online, and if being hacked or having our computers shut down because of a power outage, okay, then making sure that those technology systems are secure and stable is crucial to our business. It's not an overhead cost, and it's part of the cost of generating revenue. And that mindset shift is important, because a lot of businesses, really all businesses today, are forced to operate as leanly as possible. And that means with as little overhead cost as possible. Okay. Well, what is overhead? Things like, for example, rent, versus what is actually part of the security apparatus that is undergirding the business's ability to generate revenue. So is the purchase of electricity, is that overhead, or is that part of the security apparatus? Well, if you're running a lot of computers or a lot of machinery, and the loss of electricity basically means that your business closes down, electricity is no longer part of overhead. Electricity is a strategic commodity that's necessary to your business for generating revenue. Okay, so that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of the security of potentially of your security apparatus is proper insurance. Okay, so if you're in my business where you act as a professional, so being loss of a license essentially means that the business is out of business. Okay, being sued, okay, without being insured, without having proper professional liability insurance, or depending on the type of structure, directors and officers insurance, okay, that could mean that the business is put out of business, because just the cost to defend a lawsuit can be so high, even if in the end you win the lawsuit. If it costs 100,000 or 200,000 or more, $200,000 or more to defend yourself in that lawsuit, can your business sustain that kind of expense and still have sufficient revenue to pay for all of the various costs that are necessary for you to generate revenue, right? So that's the point of having professional liability insurance. Its most important function usually is that it covers defending you and your company against a charge of failure to perform properly, in a professional context. Okay? So these setting up the proper security apparatus, the proper security aspects of your business is crucial to its ability to continue to trade. Okay, in this case, I'm using trade in a very general sense, i.e., generate revenue. So, where are your business's vulnerabilities? Okay, so that's number two. All right, number three. Geography creates opportunity and constraints. Okay, so going back to now looking at this first from a naval standpoint. So some countries have natural harbors, they have coastline. They're not, for example, like Austria, landlocked. Okay. And others have choke points that shape national success. Okay. So geography both limits even powerful nations, but it can also create opportunities. So if you're familiar, I've used the Mediterranean Sea as an example already. If you're familiar with the Mediterranean Sea, there's this sort of strange situation whereby the entrance to the Mediterranean to the north is guarded essentially, not so much anymore, but especially in the time of Mahan, it was guarded by Gibraltar, and one had to pass through the Straits of Gibraltar in order to enter the Mediterranean Sea. Now, this became a potential choke point on Great Britain. As the preeminent naval power, it needed to be able to freely navigate the seas. And yet, Gibraltar is, at the time, was part of Spain. And Spain was one of the rival sea powers to Great Britain. So Great Britain basically took a hold of Gibraltar, and Gibraltar to this day remains part of the British Empire, right? So Great Britain decided that it had to control the Straits of Gibraltar in order to achieve its national objectives, right? So it turned a choke point into essential. I mean, it diffused a choke point by taking control of the choke point, right? So and for other sea powers, well, France had a northern coast as well as a southern coast. So France wasn't necessarily hampered by Great Britain controlling Gibraltar. Italy was never a particularly strong naval power, and even less so countries like Greece, etc. So by taking Gibraltar away from one of its greatest rivals, Great Britain was able to use geography to create opportunity. Okay, and then especially after the Suez Canal was built, so now a sea route was developed through the Mediterranean Sea down through the Suez Canal, and Great Britain could get to her colonies in, for example, India in a much shorter time than if she had to sail down the coast, the west coast of Africa, all the way around the Cape of Good Hope, and then back up the east coast of Africa and into the Indian Ocean and on to India, right? So this perception of how geography creates opportunities or constrains opportunities is a very important aspect of understanding how sea power impacts history and the fates of nations. Okay, so we may have similar geographic issues in a business. Okay, so you may have just a local business, right? I don't mean just in the sense of just, but your business may operate locally, and that's great. What would happen if you were able to expand the reach of your business, right? This was a crucial question in the 1980s and 1990s as commerce globalized. And what turned out to be the biggest driver of the ability of smaller local regional businesses to expand their reach geographically was, of course, the internet. So as e-commerce developed, the ability of small businesses to reach far beyond what otherwise would have been the geographic constraints of operating in even a big city like Los Angeles, let alone a smaller town like, say, Ventura or Oxnard, something like that. All of a sudden, almost any business could have a worldwide reach. Okay. So this is how we define our market, the tools available for accessing that market. Okay. That all creates opportunity or constraints. Okay. So there are still people today who are somewhat computer phobic and don't use the internet. So I was listening to a podcast yesterday morning. It's called the Odd Lots Podcast, and its name is indicative of the topics. It's a business podcast, and it talks about sort of just various subjects. In this particular case, they were interviewing the owner of, I guess, a hot restaurant in Washington, D.C. called Butterworth's. I believe that's what it's called. And the owner of the restaurant, one of the questions they asked him was, where do you get your supplies from? Because in this day and age, most restaurants get their supplies from companies like Cisco, big nationwide, indeed almost worldwide suppliers. And so there's a tremendous homogenization of the kind of fare that one gets at a typical restaurant. Now, that didn't used to be the case. When I was a kid, it just didn't work that way. There hadn't been the consolidation in restaurant supply that there is today. Restaurants like Butterworth's, which are uh, um, higher end, typically high end restaurants, they eschew the use of suppliers like Cisco. And in the case of Butterworth's, almost everything is locally sourced. So I guess they do something called tallow fries. I've never had these. And they do beef bones and the tallow is in the bones is I guess particularly good. One of the hosts, the hostess, it's a man and a woman who host the show. She evidently loves tallow, and so she was talking about how delicious it was, and she's like, where do you get these bones? And he said, well, we get them from a Mennonite ranch that supplies us, I guess, each day or whatever. And they said, but you can't go on the internet and order from this, Mennonite company. Basically, they don't use the internet. Okay? And indeed, they don't use, I believe, any kind of mechanization. Okay, so once a week, he can call him on a phone that's at, I guess, the local store, because people don't have phones in their houses. And he lets him know what he needs, or, he finds out what the fellow has and then sets up the deliveries for the coming week. Okay. And so the menu at the restaurant changes every day based on what's locally available. Okay. Now that's a very different model from a Chili's or whatever, where the standard menu is part of their attraction, evidently. Okay. The Mennonite farmer who eschews technology, he has made a decision that he's only going to supply the local market, the market that is as far away as he can get using his horse-drawn conveyances. And in fact, the restaurant owner was saying that he has to make special arrangements because the deliveries have to happen so early. They have to happen early in the mornings because the Mennonite fellow does not want to be in Washington, D.C. with all the traffic and the noise, because it's too disturbing to himself and his horse or horses, whatever, I don't know how many he uses to draw his wagon. It's fascinating. In this day and age, we think everybody's on the internet. No, that is not the case. So in this case of the Mennonite farmer, he has purposely decided to work within the constraints of geography that he has set for himself. Okay, so, and this restaurant, Butterworth's, has made the strategic decision that because they want to serve the freshest, the best food available, okay, they're going to have a menu that changes every day. They're going to accommodate someone who has to make deliveries at, I think it was 3 o'clock in the morning, that kind of thing, right? This is a very different perspective on running a business than I think most of us would have. That's why the podcast, frankly, was so fascinating, right? So we need to think about geography in that strategic way. Just because we can go worldwide, do we want to? Businesses that were worldwide when the tariffs hit back in April, I think some of them may have thought, "Oh, gosh, I was wrong to be so dependent on foreign markets," right? So these are the kinds of risks with which we have to deal when our geography expands. Okay, so geography creates opportunity and constraints. Okay, next. Long-term strategy beats tactical wins. So one of the things that Mahan noted in his study of naval history was that wars were won generally by sustained dominance, not individual battles. So tactical victories without a strategy for how the war would eventually be won often led to essentially exhaustion of one's forces to no long-term benefit. Okay. And so again, the strategy needs to be based on a vision beyond just the win today or the win this month or even the wins this year. Okay. So from a business perspective, sometimes a short-term win can actually weaken the long-term prospects for a company. So let's say the company decides on a new product launch and it spends a tremendous amount of resources developing and launching that product. Okay. And let's say the product is reasonably successful. Okay. But if it doesn't integrate into the overall plan for the business, now a lot of resources have been drained off and probably will continue to be drained off in support of this new product at the expense of the existing business. Okay. Now, if the development of that new product is the harbinger of a strategic shift on the part of that business, okay, good. So then that new product is part of a new long-term strategy. But if the existing products or services or both of that business remain viable long-term, then the bleeding off of resources to support something new that doesn't integrate with the other parts of the business is probably weakening the long-term position of the business. And we see this all the time. Well, not all the time, but we see this in mergers where companies think, we're going to bulk up, and just the bulking up is going to give us market dominance. That's not necessarily true. So we've seen it in the merger. This is going back into the 80s and 90s. The merger of Warner Brothers with AOL. The idea was that they were going to create this behemoth company that was going to dominate the market. The problem was, among other things, the various products and services of those companies did not mesh nearly as well as the people supporting the merger had thought they would. That's number one. And number two, the cultures of the companies were so different that, again, the companies, as they tried to integrate the companies, it became increasingly clear that close integration was just not going to work. And in many ways, that merger, it just never lived up to what people thought it would do. Looking today, where Paramount and Netflix are both looking to grab a hold of, I think it's Warner Brothers again, if I'm not mistaken, right? So among the discussions that I've heard on this topic is, how does owning a production studio, the sort of nuts and bolts, real estate oriented aspect of an entertainment and media company, how does that support the long-term objective of Netflix, which has never owned those kinds of assets and as a result has been able to grow fast? It wasn't held down by a huge capital investment in plant and equipment, and so it could devote its resources to just licensing or producing the best content without all of the overhead, right? Versus Paramount, which they already own a studio. Do they really need another studio? What is it really? Are they really going to get the synergies out of owning yet more streaming services, right? Where is the long-term plan, the long-term strategy that's going to result in a stronger company once whoever ends up being successful? And I've heard lots of great analysis about which one will end up being successful. Where is the analysis that shows that the long-term strategy is indeed viable? Okay. And in many ways, this is almost like, you'll forgive the metaphor, hyenas, fighting over the scraps of the legacy entertainment and media business, right? So, it's interesting to watch from a business perspective, and it is very difficult to predict the future, of course. But I think some of the lessons of prior mergers need to be looked at. For our own businesses, we need to be as clear as possible. What is our long-term strategy? And then whatever we're doing, we need to be as clear and objective in assessing how a particular product, a particular service will or will not support our long-term strategy. And we need to be fairly ruthless in not engaging in what end up becoming distractions. Okay, the last one, probably maybe not the most relevant for businesses. I'm going to talk about it just briefly, and that is national policy shapes commercial success. So from Mayer's perspective, governments that aligned naval strategy and commercial policy prospered. That's certainly the case with Great Britain, right? A large reason for the existence of the Royal Navy was to protect Great Britain's merchant fleet. So the two worked together, I don't want to say literally seamlessly, but they worked in a very symbiotic fashion for the betterment of the country and commerce as a whole. Okay, disconnected policies led to decline. Okay, so countries that perhaps engage, I think one could make the case that for Germany in this respect. So when the Kaiser went on a big shipbuilding initiative, he diverted a lot of money into building up his navy. But Germany really didn't have any empire to protect. They had always been a land power. And so the buildup of a navy didn't really align with any kind of commercial policy. It was really just kind of a sapping of the wealth of Germany into something that was kind of a vanity project on the part of the Kaiser, right? So it's important that government policy and commercial policies align, okay? They need to be symbiotic. Now, where do we see that today? Well, I'm going to go back to that podcast about the restaurant in Washington, D.C., because the host asked him what I think is the show largely tries to eschew politics. But one of the questions they asked him is, how have, for example, immigration policy impacted your business? Okay. And one of the things he said was that with the reduction of the number of people in this country illegally, okay, his ability to attract and hold employees for his restaurant got more difficult. As a result, he had to raise the wages of his employees and take other steps in order to retain them and keep their loyalty to his restaurant. Okay, so there seemed to be kind of an implication that current immigration policy was at odds with what would be best for the restaurant business. Now, I mean, that was again, that was kind of the sense I got from the way the hosts asked the question. It's interesting to note, though, that in a high-end restaurant where quality of service is so important and quality of food is so important, having continuity of staffing would seem to me, as someone who I've never run a restaurant, okay, I've worked at fast food places, never run a restaurant, but it just seems to me that that would truly benefit that particular restaurant. And so, was government policy, or is government policy misaligned with the needs of the restaurant business, or is it actually better aligned now, right? And that's what I call a bourbon question. It's best discussed over bourbon. So my point is not to say yes or no on that issue. It's only to point out that, especially in the time, it may not be obvious whether government policy is at odds with commercial policy or is aligned with commercial policy. Okay, and also, in a country like the United States, where we seem to, go back and forth between parties in terms of leadership and such, so there is going to be some changes, right? And so, how do we deal with a somewhat to very volatile government policy environment? Okay, I know how I deal with it. I seek to be in businesses that are as little impacted by government policy as possible. That's how I handle that particular issue. So for me, aside from tax policy that affects my clients and me in terms of paying taxes, and some regulatory policy that deals with real estate, okay, what happens within the government doesn't impact my business and my clients nearly as much as it would impact other businesses that are much more highly regulated. For example, banking, securities, right? And in fact, I was offered an opportunity to become essentially a registered investment advisor, and I worked on it for a while, and I decided I just didn't want to be in that heavily government regulated business, right? And so that's why I ended up doing what I'm doing now. Okay, so I think we need to look at where government policy and our businesses have to interact and how symbiotic is that interaction. Here in California, of course, we're the poster child for government burdening business, and that is certainly the case. California burdens businesses much more highly than other states do, right? So it's a matter of both government policy, but also geography, going back to one of the prior issues. Okay, so real quickly, just summarizing the points that I covered today. Sea power as a system, not a fleet. Trade follows security. Geography creates opportunity and constraint. Long-term strategy beats tactical wins. And finally, national policy shapes commercial success. So those are the first 5 of Mahan's ideas that we can apply to our businesses and professional practices. I look forward to continuing this discussion with you over the next 3 weeks. So thank you very much for joining me. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. is my show, People Making Money. 10 a.m. Pacific time. I hope you'll join me for that. And that only leaves me to thank you again very much for joining me. Wishing you a wonderful rest of the day. Signing off as I always do. Marie, darling, you are my belle. Courage at all times.